At 92 years old, Hollywood's golden boy Van Johnson made a confession that stopped people in their tracks. A night so wild, so unbelievable, that it destroyed the image of the perfect boy next door. 8 actors, one night. And yet, this wasn't the glamorous fantasy people imagined, it was something far darker. Because behind that charming smile, the freckles and the all-American innocence that MGM sold to the world, Van Johnson was fighting battles that no audience ever saw. He was the idol of teenage girls, the clean-cut hero of wartime America. But he also lived under secrets, pressures and scars that never healed. His story is not just about fame. It's about what Hollywood took from him and what he risked in order to be himself. From a broken childhood in Rhode Island to a chance encounter with Lucille Ball, from a carefully staged marriage to whispers of forbidden love, this is the real story of Van Johnson. And once you hear it, you'll never look at him the same way again. Van Johnson's life didn't begin with Hollywood lights or glittering fame. It began with silence and loss. Born on August 25, 1916 in Newport, Rhode Island, little Charles Vandell Johnson grew up in a home where warmth was absent. His mother walked away when he was just a boy, leaving a wound so deep it never truly healed. And his father? Cold, distant, a man who never once gave him the comfort he craved. So where did Van go? Into his imagination, into daydreams of applause, of stage lights, of being seen in a way he never was at home. He wasn't just playing pretend. He was building an escape route, a future where he could be anyone but the lonely boy left behind in Newport. But Newport was no place for dreamers. It was small, quiet, and quick to crush big ambitions. For Van, that only meant one thing: he had to leave. With barely any money, just a suitcase and the fire of determination, he set his eyes on New York City, the place where Broadway burned bright and nobodies became stars. It was a decision that would change everything, but the road to fame would be cruel, and the first steps nearly broke him. Because behind that charming smile, the freckles and the all-American innocence that MGM sold to the world, Van Johnson was fighting battles that no audience ever saw. He was the idol of teenage girls, the clean-cut hero of wartime America. But he also lived under secrets, pressures and scars that never healed. His story is not just about fame. It's about what Hollywood took from him and what he risked in order to be himself. From a broken childhood in Rhode Island to a chance encounter with Lucille Ball, from a carefully staged marriage to whispers of forbidden love, this is the real story of Van Johnson. And once you hear it, you'll never look at him the same way again. New York wasn't kind to Van Johnson. The city of dreams turned out to be a battlefield, and he was just another unknown kid fighting to survive. He worked as a waiter, a doorman, even a bit player in shabby nightclubs. Some nights he went to bed hungry, shoes worn thin, stomach empty, but his spirit never broke. Every free moment he sang, he danced, he practiced, shaping himself into the performer he was determined to become. And then, fate intervened. One night during a small performance at a Manhattan nightclub, a pair of sharp eyes in the audience locked on him. It was Lucille Ball. At that time, she wasn't the global legend of I Love Lucy. She was still climbing, still proving herself. But Lucille had something Hollywood couldn't teach: instinct. She could spot talent when others overlooked it. What she saw in Van wasn't just his striking red hair, freckles, or that radiant smile. She saw energy. She saw heart, something real in an industry full of masks. After the show, she didn't just walk away. She walked up to him, spoke to him, and made a decision that would alter his destiny. Lucille Ball believed in him. She introduced him to Broadway producers, urging them, "Give this kid a chance. He's got something." And they listened. Those first small Broadway roles weren't glamorous. Just a few lines here, a minor part there. But for Van, they were everything. They were the first bricks in the foundation of a dream. Every step on that stage, he carried gratitude for Lucille Ball, the woman who saw him when no one else did. Without her, the story of Van Johnson might have ended in that nightclub. But with her, the doors of Broadway cracked open. And beyond those doors, Hollywood was already waiting. Hollywood in the 1940s wasn't just a city. It was a kingdom. And when Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer came calling, Van Johnson knew he had been summoned into a world where stars weren't born. They were manufactured. MGM saw something in him that was priceless. The freckles, the red hair, that wide and innocent smile, he was the perfect boy next door. While other actors oozed danger or smoldering mystery, Van was the one mothers trusted, teenage girls adored, and America needed. And then history itself handed him the role of a lifetime. World War II had swept the globe, and Hollywood's biggest leading men, Clark Gable, James Stewart, Henry Fonda, were gone, serving overseas. But Van, he couldn't go. A devastating car accident left a steel plate in his head, disqualifying him from the military. What should have been tragedy became opportunity. While America's heroes fought on the battlefield, Van Johnson stayed behind and became the face of courage on the screen. Films like A Guy Named Joe, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, and The Human Comedy didn't just entertain, they lifted a nation in pain. Van's smile, his warmth, his unwavering wholesomeness gave audiences something to hold on to. He became a symbol of hope, the neighbor next door reminding people that everything would be okay. By the mid-1940s, Van Johnson wasn't just another contract player at MGM. He was a star, carefully shaped, meticulously managed, and adored by millions. But while the world saw America's golden boy, Van carried a truth he could never show. Because in Hollywood, the brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadows it hides. For years, MGM painted Van Johnson as the clean-cut hero, the dependable all-American boy. But Van was determined to prove he was more than just a smile on a poster. He wanted respect. He wanted to show the world that he could act. That moment came with the Caine Mutiny. Acting alongside the legendary Humphrey Bogart, Van played Lieutenant Steve Merrick, a man torn by impossible choices in the middle of war. It was a role that demanded depth, vulnerability, and emotional honesty, and Van delivered. Critics who had once dismissed him as just another commercial star were forced to admit it. This was no lightweight. This was a serious actor. And he didn't stop there. In musicals like Brigadoon, starring with Gene Kelly, Van proved he wasn't just a dramatic actor. He could sing. He could dance. He could do it all. In an industry quick to put stars in a box, Van Johnson shattered every label. He was a triple threat, and audiences adored him for it. Fan mail poured in by the thousands. Teenage girls wrote to him every week, declaring their devotion. His popularity rivaled giants like Frank Sinatra and Clark Gable. Around the world, he wasn't just seen as a movie star, he was a beacon of optimism in a world still healing from war. But here's the truth. The bigger Van Johnson became, the less control he had over his own life. MGM wasn't just selling movies, they were selling him. His image, his relationships, even his personal happiness were part of the contract. And when rumors began to spread, the studio made a decision that would change his life forever. In 1947, Hollywood was stunned. Van Johnson, the golden boy of MGM, was suddenly getting married to actress Eve Abbott. The timing raised eyebrows. Just one day earlier, Eve had finalized her divorce from actor Keenan Wynn, one of Van's closest friends. The rush made the gossip columns explode with questions. Years later, it was Eve Abbott herself who gave her side of the story. According to her, the marriage wasn't born out of love but out of pressure. She claimed that MGM executives, led by Louis B. Mayer, pushed her into marrying Van. Their goal? To silence the growing rumors about Van's personal life, rumors that in 1940s Hollywood could destroy a career overnight. They needed their big star to marry, Eve recalled bitterly. And unfortunately, I was the only woman he'd marry. To the public, Van and Eve looked perfect. A daughter named Skylar, plus Eve's 2 sons from her previous marriage, whom Van adopted. They smiled for the cameras, posed for magazines, and became the model Hollywood family. But behind closed doors, Eve later described a very different reality. She said Van could be moody, withdrawn, and scarred by the emotional wounds of his childhood. Whenever conflict arose, he would shut himself away, retreating into silence. It was a marriage crafted for appearances, a story written by the studio, not by love. While audiences adored Van Johnson as the clean-cut boy next door, Hollywood insiders whispered about another life. In the 1940s and 1950s, there was an underground world in Hollywood. Secret parties tucked away in Beverly Hills mansions, Laurel Canyon hideaways, and even locked studio lots after hours. Away from the cameras, stars could finally breathe, and according to the rumors, Van was part of this hidden world. Stories linked him to names like Roddy McDowell, Farley Granger, Clifton Webb, Anthony Perkins, and even a young Rock Hudson. But the boldest rumor of all was one that spread like wildfire, that Van once boasted of spending a single night with 8 actors. Was it true? Almost certainly exaggerated. But the very fact that this rumor existed reveals something deeper, that Van was seen as a man trapped between 2 worlds. On screen, he was America's safe, wholesome hero. Behind the curtain, gossip painted him as someone living a double life, always hiding from the studio machine. These weren't just scandals. They were survival stories, whispers of a man trying to find freedom in an industry that gave him everything, but demanded his true self remain invisible. By the early 1960s, the carefully built image of Van Johnson began to fracture. While performing in London's The Music Man, a story surfaced that would change everything. According to Ned Wynn, Eve Abbott's son, Van had fallen for a young male dancer in the show. Van left the family for this man, Ned later said. He left my mother for the lead dancer. Whether the details were entirely true or not, the marriage couldn't survive. After years of strain, the divorce between Van and Eve was finalized in 1968. The perfect Hollywood family was gone, and Van was left with the heavy price of living in 2 worlds. Still, his career carried on. He shifted into television, appearing in Murder, She Wrote and The Love Boat, and returned to stage musicals where his talent shined as brightly as ever. But the frenzy of his peak years was long over. By the 1990s, Van retired to a quiet New York penthouse with views of the East River. In his final years, as his health declined, he moved to a care facility upstate. On December 12, 2008, Van Johnson passed away at 92. No flashing cameras, no headlines, just silence. And in that silence remains a paradox. A man who gave hope to millions, yet according to those closest to him, was never allowed to fully live as himself. So, was the story true? Did Van Johnson really spend one wild night with 8 actors? Maybe, maybe not. But here's the truth. The number was never what mattered. What mattered was what it revealed about Hollywood. A world where studios staged marriages to protect profits. A world where love had to be hidden in shadows. A world where the price of stardom was often your very identity. Van Johnson wasn't just the cheerful boy next door that audiences adored. He was a man torn between who he had to be in public and who he longed to be in private. He gave hope to millions during wartime, became a symbol of optimism in a broken world, and yet inside, he carried scars that never healed. When we look back at Van, we see more than a movie star. We see resilience. We see a man who survived abandonment, who fought through loneliness, who lived through an industry that demanded perfection while crushing authenticity. And maybe, just maybe, his greatest legacy isn't the films, or the fan mail, or even the smile that lit up the screen. His greatest legacy is the reminder that behind every Hollywood legend, there's a human being, fragile, flawed, and fighting to be free. Van Johnson's story wasn't just about fame. It was about sacrifice. It was about secrets. And it was about the courage to live, even when the world wouldn't accept the truth.